The IMF has imposed surcharges on debtor countries in different forms since its founding, with the justification that they would prevent larger and longer borrowing. But historically, the evidence actually points to the opposite. We now know that on 3 separate occasions over the last 50 years, the IMF has eliminated these surcharge policies because they failed to fulfill their purpose and they didn't work. Additionally, IMF staff have actually admitted that surcharges feature perverse incentives. So instead of encouraging lower borrowing and faster repayment, they actually add to countries' debt burdens and they make it more difficult for them to pay off their loans faster. And so when the current surcharges policy was instituted in 1997, which is in response to the Asian financial crisis at the time, some members of the IMF board of directors dissented, and they warned that surcharges would actually be counterproductive and that they would add to the balance of payments problems that countries were already facing. And we can now see that, this is exactly what's happening today and what's happened in the past. And this is kind of best demonstrated by the top 5 surcharge paying countries, which repeatedly refinance their IMF loans, which are nearing maturity, with new IMF programs, thereby extending their repayment and continuing to pay surcharges into the future. And in this way, surcharges feature an additional perverse incentive in that they act as a penalty, right? It's a policy that penalizes countries for the amounts that they borrowed, which doesn't make sense because the IMF controls and approves large amounts of borrowing. And so essentially, countries are being penalized without having incurred any kind of penalty. The IMF also uses surcharges as another source of revenue to boost its capital base. But it actually doesn't need surcharges as extra income because it has already reached its target for precautionary balances in 2024. And according to its own estimates, even if surcharges are completely eliminated, the IMF would stay above target for years to come. The IMF also has alternative sources of financing, including large reserves of gold, which it still values at 1960s prices. So if it were to value just a portion of its gold at market prices, it would significantly boost its capital base. Up until recently, the IMF failed to provide regular and comprehensive information on surcharges, which made it difficult to calculate how much countries have paid in the past, how much they're currently paying, and what they will owe in the future. In 2023, the IMF did start publishing historical data on surcharges and partial future estimates. But these estimates are still opaque and they're actually much lower than what countries will end up paying. This is because the IMF does not include surcharges payments on future loan disbursements of existing debt in these calculations, meaning that if a country is scheduled to receive a portion of their loan in a future year, the amount due in surcharges on that disbursement is not being included in the IMF's estimates. And so the estimate ends up being quite a bit lower than what the country will end up paying. At CEPR, we include future disbursements in our estimates, and so we provide a more accurate picture of what countries will end up paying in future years.
All right, so surcharges are harmful. They have no rationale. What can we do about it and why now? Now, for a long time, the IMF surcharge policy really went under the radar. And that was in large part because the IMF was pretty opaque about it. Didn't publish information on what countries were paying surcharges, how much they were paying. But as the pandemic began, as it was clear that this economic crisis was going to increasingly affect developing countries, more and more would be paying surcharges, there was some increased scrutiny. And in 2021, CEPR, in fact, published what we believe to be the first independent estimate of IMF surcharges. Now, since that moment, there's been a massive global call to either suspend surcharges for many years or to discontinue the policy entirely. Now, I've already spoken about Nobel laureate economists like Joe Stiglitz, UN human rights experts, but these calls have also come from the UN Secretary General, the UN Global Crisis Response Group, the G77, which represents nearly every developing country in the world, has clearly called to end the surcharge policy entirely. And then just hundreds of civil society organizations, including those in impacted countries like Ukraine, but also massive global organizations, humanitarian groups like Oxfam, climate groups like 350.org, the International Trade Union Confederation. All of these have criticized the policy and called to either suspend or eliminate them. Now, Congress has also had very important work. In early 2022, a number of members of Congress sent a letter calling to end the policy, which drew a lot of attention. And a few months later, Representatives Jim Himes and Chuy Garcia introduced the Stop Onerous Surcharges Act. The Stop Onerous Surcharges Act calls for a comprehensive review of the surcharge policy and the suspension of all surcharge payments while that review is taking place. Now, that actually passed the House as an amendment to the NDAA in 2022 and was recently reintroduced in the House, this time by Representatives Joyce Beatty and Chuy Garcia. So all of this pressure combined over the course of years has finally led the IMF to recognize that it's time to do something about this. And so in April of this year, the IMF announced that they will be conducting an internal review of the surcharge policy. Now, this is a great win. It's a huge window of opportunity, but there's also a risk that this is really just a box-checking exercise. They know there's a lot of criticism and just want to review it. So it's really up to us to make sure that this is a substantive review that takes seriously the possibility and the need to discontinue the policy entirely. And that's where we come in. That's where members of Congress come in. The IMF's review takes into account stakeholder positions. And there is no stakeholder at the IMF with a greater voice, with more influence than the United States. So whatever is happening in the US, whatever members of Congress are saying, all of this is going to have a great impact on the outcome of this review of the surcharge policy, which is taking place sometime this summer, possibly going to end sometime this year. So that's why we need members of Congress to really do what they can to draw attention to this issue. In the House, that might mean joining on to the Stop Onerous Surcharges Act. In the Senate, it might mean supporting similar legislation or legislation explicitly calling to eliminate the policy. But in general, it also just means making our voices heard, making it clear that it's time to do away with this policy, that we want surcharges to go, making this clear publicly, making this clear privately to the Biden administration, so that together we can make sure that this is not just an exercise in checking boxes, but that this review is meaningful and that we can finally do away with the surcharge policy once and for all.